Seems like a long time ago, but it was probably only about a year ago that I was in a coffee shop back when you could do things like that without having to worry about anything. And there'd been I had a good non-Christian friend, and we'd had lots of conversations about the Christian faith. This was a Monday morning, and he came to me very excited because he'd actually been to church the Sunday before. His wife had dragged him along. He himself goes between saying he's an agnostic and an atheist. Anyway, he'd gone to church, and in the scripture text that was read, there was a gospel text. It was a text that was very, very bloodthirsty. And the thing that shocked him completely and utterly was that the bloodthirsty words came from Jesus. When the two and I had often talked, he would often say certain things like, he thinks Christianity is a whole pile of bump, but Jesus is sort of a good guy. And he, in fact, would have said that one of the problems he has with Christianity, with all religion, is that the teachings promote prejudice, it promotes genocide, it promotes hatred. You sort of give it a little bit of a special place for Jesus. So he was pretty shocked for Jesus to appear to have said something very bloodthirsty. So he asked me about it. And I didn't tell him to shut up or just believe or anything like that. I said, that's a really good question. And I got my phone out, I found the text, and we ended up having a conversation. Now, I mentioned that. My name is George Sinclair, by the way. I'm the chair of Dig and Delve, which is this apologetics organization here in Ottawa. I'm also the pastor of a local church, Church of the Messiah. And Dig and Delve exists to help Christians and help the city. By the city, we mean Muslims, atheists, secular people, spiritual people, people who don't want to have anything to do with religion. We want to help people in the city recognize and ask the deepest questions that human beings ask. And this story that I've just told you, it might sound like it's just a bit of a technical question that just is of a concern for Christians. But if you think about it, behind that question is something which is a great preoccupation in our culture. I'm not going to mention the names of any of these movies, but I just finished watching a very good thriller movie. And in the thriller movie, there was a woman trying to deal with a whole group of guys who were really, really, really bad. And one of the people who came into her life and was very, very, very helpful throughout most of the movie, and at the end of the movie, you discovered that, in fact, he wasn't a good guy who was helping her, that he, in fact, was in charge of all the bad guys, and he'd been attempting to orchestrate her death. It's not unusual to watch a film or something in Netflix or a TV series where you see maybe a sister being very concerned that her sister, a woman, concerned that her sister had started to fall in love with a guy. And the sister starts to have a concern, the woman starts to have a concern that her sister, she's falling in love with this guy, but that maybe he's actually not a good guy. Maybe he's in fact a very, very bad man, an evil man. And so you see, there's something really deep in our culture of a concern when it comes to people as to whether or not they are a good person, a true person, a faithful person, or whether, in fact, actually they just want to kill you. They just want to ruin you. And if you think about it, that's actually the same type of thing that goes on when we ask a far more deep, that's a very, very important question as it is, but it's also a very important question at a deeper and more fundamental level. It might be, of course, that there is no God that exists, but if there is, in fact, some type of spiritual reality or spiritual being, is that spiritual reality, is that spiritual being, is the way that people talk about it, is it in fact something fundamentally good, loving, true, trustworthy? Or is it in fact something like a moral monster that it just wants to devour you? You might not know this, in fact, most people don't, but one of the things which is very unique about the book of Genesis and its story about how God created all beings is that in the entire ancient Near East, the gods created human beings to be their slaves. But in the Bible, God creates human beings to bear their image and to be fruitful and multiply. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It's a very, very, very important question to ask. Is that, in fact, if there is a spiritual reality, but that spiritual reality is ultimately one that just wants to make you a slave and devour you, we should have nothing to do with such a God? Or is there, in fact, a God that is our refuge, our hope, our place of rest, our confidence that's true and good and loving? And we're going to walk towards this question tonight with the help of Daniel Gilman, who will be introduced more in a moment. Just a couple of little technical things before we get into the presentation. We're all about questions in Dig and Delve. We love questions. We really do. We don't want to be some of those Christians who are afraid of questions. There are all sorts of people in our culture who don't want questions. We want to model hearing good questions and walking towards them and having good conversations, because you learn what is true by asking good questions and not being afraid of them. So we want to have you ask questions, and if you have registered for this event, there's two ways to ask questions. One, if you're on YouTube Live, you can go ahead and ask questions. You know how to do that better than I don't have to tell you. If you've registered, there's a way to do that as well, and people who have registered for the event will have priority in their questions. And that's important to know, because this is going to be the first of a series of events, and other than in January, it will always be the first Friday night of the month, where we're going to look at a variety of different questions in the months to come. And we'd love it if you're involved, and always ask your best questions. One other thing, or two other things. First, about halfway through this presentation, and there'll be a bit of a notification on the screen, there'll be a way to win prizes. And so you just pay attention to that, and we just like to bless you by giving you a prize. And I'd just like to thank our sponsors, Celebration Baptist Church, the Metropolitan Bible Church, Arlington Woods Free Methodist Church, Church of the Messiah, which is part of the Anglican Network in Canada, Calvary Baptist, Chapel Ridge, Free Methodist, I believe they are, Reasons to Believe, the Ottawa chapter, Resurrection Church, which is part of the PCA, or Presbyterian Church in America, Sequoia, another Baptist church, Sunnyside, a Wesleyan church, and West Village, which, like the Met, is part of the Associated Gospel Churches of Canada. We're really grateful for these sponsors that are allowing us to put this on free of charge. So we're really glad you're here. We hope you give us your feedback about how to do this better. Give us your feedback about the type of deep questions that human beings ask that you would like us to address, and we would love to do that. So without saying anything more, I'm now going to turn it over to Jen and Daniel, and she'll introduce Daniel. And once again, we're looking forward to great questions.
Welcome here. And Daniel, I want to say welcome to you. Welcome back to Dig and Delve.
Thanks, Jen.
I have to say it's amazing to have you here in person, because almost nobody is here in person. So thank you for coming all the way to Ottawa.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a couple years since you've been here. You have a background in justice, in leadership development, in expository teaching, and now you are a full-time speaker and apologist. Mm-hmm. What makes you want to spend your time and energy on apologetics at this point in our nation's history, in the church's history, maybe in our culture's history? Why is it important?
Well, thanks, Jen. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. So apologetics is a fancy term meaning looking at the credibility or the reason for something. And so apologetics about the Bible, about Jesus, is looking at the credibility of Jesus, the credibility of Christianity. Is there a solid reason to believe that Jesus is who he says he is, or is it just a fiction? And I became passionate about this because I was born into a Christian family, and I loved God from when I was a tiny little kid. I don't even remember when I began to love him. But over the years, in mid-high school and beginning of university, I began to have these raw questions about Christianity, raw questions about the Bible and God. And I didn't know what to do with these at first. And as I discovered apologetics and began to read excellent speakers and writers on this stuff, I saw that my questions were welcome and that I could really be intellectually honest about the questions I was asking. When I opened up the Bible myself and saw how Jesus handles people who have intellectual doubts about him, people like John the Baptist, who is his cousin, or Thomas, another friend. It's very painful when your friends or family don't believe in you. Mm-hmm. Jesus actually welcomed their questions. And when they expressed doubt that he was everything he said he was, instead of telling them, just believe, just have faith, in a blind way, just have blind faith, Jesus actually invited them to consider the evidence about who he is. And in doing so, he invites them more intimately close to him, especially Thomas. He actually invites him to touch the wounds from the cross, the wounds in Jesus. That is very intimate. And so I found that not only are you able to wrestle with these questions in terms of with the Bible, but actually that like God himself invites us more intimately into his presence. And so as I found great comfort in wrestling through this, discovering that I'm convinced, in being intellectually honest, honest that God is not a fiction, that he really is real, whether I even like it or not. I became passionate about what apologetics has done for me, and now it's an immense joy being able to speak across Canada and sometimes across the world, inviting people like Jesus to be intellectually honest with the doubts and questions they have and to examine whether or not it's really true.
Well, that's awesome. And I know that this topic that we're going to be presenting tonight is one that you speak of with some frequency. Is this a personal topic for you? Is this something that you've personally wrestled with? And is that why it is something that you like to share with others?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, and it goes back to like being a kid again. I remember being about 7 or 8, whenever it was that I really learned to read, and I pried open a Bible I found in my parents' home, and I went looking for some of the stories I heard in Sunday school. I went to find some of my heroes, and it might have been David. I think it might have been David and Bathsheba, actually. I came to the story, and I was like, oh, David, the one who fought the giant. And so I opened it up, and I'm like slowly, with phonics, and like reading the thing, and I felt so dirty. I felt like I'd come across a dirty stash of something. I felt gross, actually, as I read this very graphic, like R-rated story. And I thought, this is David? Like, what? And the same as I began reading through the Bible in the following years, just so many of the stories that we've been taught in Sunday school that are so inspiring and clean. If you read the actual Bible story, it's pretty sometimes grotesque and messy and painful and confusing. And it led me not only to be questioning whether or not God is real, but even if he's real, is he good? Is he a moral monster, or is he actually a gracious God? And this is not only a question I've had to wrestle with myself back then. 2020 is brutal for everybody, and it seems like it's a special brutal for everybody. My wife and I are no exception. We've gone through some terrible, terrible stuff this year. And even this week, I got some fresh news of tragedy too close to home. And I found myself, as I was even preparing for this event, the question, like, is God actually good, or is he a monster? It was all too close to home for me. So it's definitely a personal question that I think a lot of people, if we're honest, find ourselves having to wrestle with. It's also not just a personal question. As I get to go and speak about who Jesus is and introduce people to the Bible in Canada and sometimes in other countries too, I find that it's often a question that secular people, non-religious people are also asking as well. So I know today we have people tuning in from a variety of religious, faith, and spiritual backgrounds, or none at all. And I think the questions we're going to be looking at today, or they're going to be your questions if you type in questions, but I think they're relevant to everybody.
Yeah, okay, great. And it's nice to know that somebody who's wrestled with it themselves is going to present. And I know that you have about 20 minutes where you're going to go through some of the themes that perhaps you have wrestled with the most and that you wanted to share to sort of get us going. So why don't you go ahead and start with that, and then we're going to move into some discussion and questions afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Yeah, so it was a year and a half ago in Cambridge, England, we just finished a lecture on the topics of the Bible and Jesus. I can't remember the exact topic of that day, but a student walked up to me there at Cambridge University. He was shaking with anger. He was that angry, and he said to me, I despise the God of the Bible. He is the most intolerable bully in all of fiction. I asked him to tell me more, and he opened the Bible to Numbers 31, verses 17 and 18, and he read these words. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with them, keep alive for yourselves. And he said, this is genocide and rape. It says, take these women for yourselves. That sounds like forced marriage, and that we would consider as sexual abuse. And kill all these guys, like, what is this? This is a call for violence from the divine, and you worship this God? I was honest with him. I thought, you know what? I've read through the Bible throughout my life, and I've never really paused on these words. These aren't words I've really like treasured and chewed on. And I said, I don't actually know how I would answer that question. And he was a little bit shocked that I was just honest with him. But I said, you know what? Let's go ask my colleague if he's ever wrestled with this. So we went over to my colleague, and my colleague heard our question, and he said, gentlemen, you're approaching this passage with typical Anglo-centric, Western, 21st century arrogance. And usually we expect like pastors to be a lot more gracious in this, but yeah, he just gave it to us like it is. And we were both a little shocked, and he said, guys, you are projecting your own culture on this text. If you just humble yourself for a moment, you'll see that it actually is a beautiful text. He said, we asked him to tell us more because we didn't see any beauty in this. We just see violence. And he said, if you actually stop and consider the context, you will see justice for the oppressed, restraint against grotesque violence, and provision for young women and girls. Justice, restraint, and provision. Well, we definitely were just waiting for him to tell us more because we had no idea where he was going. And he said, here you see, first, you have to ask the question, why? That's a good question to bring to any text you see that is disturbing. Why is it there? And God is very clear. The various passages where he brings judgment to a context, to a people, it's because of his concern for the oppressed and the marginalized and the exploited. The people, the Midianites in this passage, were people that were quite similar to the people at Sodom and Gomorrah. That's one of the most famous passages of judgment in the Bible, the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in Ezekiel 16, God is very clear. It's one of the most defining moments of judgment in the Bible. God says, and this is a direct quote, Ezekiel 16, this is the sin of Sodom. They had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but they did not aid the poor and the needy. You can see in this that God had been patient for years with these people who were neglecting the poor and the needy. But God so cares about the well-being of the poor and the needy. That's not only those who were abusing and oppressing them, but those who were indifferent to their plight also receive judgment. Because God expects every one of us to not be okay with things that are not okay. And so God brings judgment. And similar types of abuse was going on with the Midianites. There was all manner of sex trafficking of children in the cult prostitution in their forms of worship. Them and surrounding nations would have a practice sometimes of offering their children in the fires as a way to burn them alive, as if that's a way to worship and praise God. Just brutal things. God was patient with them, giving them a chance to turn away from these vile, toxic, oppressive practices. In the case of the Midianites, not only had they done this type of stuff, but they'd actually enticed the people of God, the Jewish people, into these same into defiling practices, and God comes to bring justice. So in this, and God putting to death those who had been perpetuating these practices, there is justice for the oppressed and the marginalized. Then there's restraint from grotesque violence. When we see a passage like this, we're reading it often in a fairly safe and harmonious context. And so to see God be calling people who believe in him to go and engage in warfare sounds like he's introducing violence into this. But my colleague pointed out that there's actually so much warfare, so much violence in the context that these words are spoken into. And the violence was intense, extreme, next level stuff. It was grotesque. The people, the Midianites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, they were so imaginative and creative in finding out ways to brutally put people to death. So they would gut people to have them bleed out to death slowly on the battlefield, and they would glory in the gore. They would regularly be sexually abusing soldiers on the battlefield as a way of just destroying them as they put them to death. And if you read their histories, they glory in the gore. It's absolutely brutal. And to that context of violence and warfare and grotesque glorying in the gore, God calls the people of Israel not to bring or introduce violence there, but to be bringing the judgment, justice, putting an end to some of these totally inappropriate, toxic practices, but to do so in a way that was as humane and as swift as possible. You don't read any glorying in gore. They're not to be doing any torturous practices that have put people to death with the sword, which was the swiftest and most humane method they would have had possible. And so there's actually restraint from the cultural violence that they were surrounded by, not introducing them into that. And then finally, there's the provision for women and girls. And this was the part that I was most concerned about. I can get the judgment and the justice stuff, but what about the women and girls? And he says, he's like, gentlemen, he said to us, you are projecting your like feminist 21st century laws and customs onto the Midianites and thinking like, so all these people have been put to death, and now to the young women and girls, some of them would have been exposed to some of the oppression, exploitation. Now to these young women and girls who are left there just to fend for themselves. And you're just like, hey, take care. He said, by their own customs and practices, not the Jewish, but the Midianite. These women wouldn't have been able to own property, have land, have shelter. They wouldn't be able to really engage in meaningful commerce or income. They would have just been isolated, dying deaths of slow starvation. And he said, God cares about these Midianite women. And so he does tell the people of Israel to bring them into their community. You need to read any text of the Bible in relation to the other texts. There's a context. And the context for Numbers 31, among other passages, is Deuteronomy 21. In Deuteronomy 21, God is clear on the step-by-step process that the people of Israel are to engage in when it comes to how do they bring these foreign women into their midst. And it's actually, I find it, after this colleague pointed out to us, quite compelling. They're to give them space to grieve the trauma of all that they've just lost. They are not to come near them for a full month. And so that excludes any like sexual intimacy of the battlefield and bringing them in. Second, you'll see that God uses the language of as wives. And that doesn't strike me at first glance, but it actually is striking for this context because the Midianites, the Hittites, all these people would regularly take women from warfare. They would take the women and they would use them as sex slaves or concubines at best. But God is clear that they're only to bring these women into their midst as wives, not as sex slaves, not as concubines. God cares about their bodily integrity. He cares about their well-being. Again, in the process, letting them have time to grieve. There's even a mechanism for letting them return if they choose to go back to where they came from. With having them only be brought in as wives, it confers legal status for them and their children. Protection, provision. It gives them dignity, human dignity, that they're not an object, a slave, but they are their wife. And that is radically different than anything you'll see in that context. And this Cambridge student, it's not like he all of a sudden just embraced the Bible as his own right then, but he did say, it's actually really beautiful. And I agree. That was that student's question. A question that I have struggled with a lot myself is, why does the Bible make provision for slavery? In the law of Moses, the Mosaic law, in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, there's various laws and regulations about slavery. And I just wish it wasn't there. I'm someone who is, like many of you tuning in, I am against human trafficking. I've had the privilege of being part of some initiatives to fight human trafficking. That's a modern form of slavery. I want to think that God is more gracious and just than I am. And if I'm against slavery, why is God allowing slavery in the Bible? I was chatting with my friend and colleague, Brandon Cleaver. He's an African-American, brilliant speaker, beloved colleague. And he challenged me to consider the perspectives, the voices of slaves. That if I'm going to be having my attitude about slavery in the Bible, why not consider how slaves have seen these passages? And he brought me to the context of the American South and the chattel slavery they had. And he said, Daniel, think about the fact that so many of the African-American slaves were introduced to Christianity by slave masters, the very people who were exploiting them in horrible ways. They were introduced to Christianity specifically in the passages of the Bible that make provision for slavery as a means for these slave masters to oppress them, as a means to try to make the slaves more compliant to being exploited. Horrible stuff. And he said, but notice that if you try to put yourself in the position of the slaves and see these passages from their perspective, many of these slaves not only embraced Christianity, but actually were against. They took these passages as grounds to be against slavery. What did they see? What was so compelling about these passages that they could see through the misappropriation of these passages by their slave masters and say, we will entrust ourselves to that God. He's worth our devotion and our allegiance. And at the same time, not become compliant to slavery. What did they see? And what they saw is that there's a difference, a radical difference in the way that God talks about slavery and the way that slavery has been practiced in the American South and throughout the world in history and today. And the difference you can see as a difference in the motivation and the means. So the motivation of slavery for anywhere it's practiced is that it's about giving the slave masters an exploitive free form of getting as wealthy as possible. It's all about the well-being of the slave master, and it's exploitive. In the Bible, it's one of God's safety nets for those who are destitute. It's about the destitute. So it says in Deuteronomy 15 that God's plan and his design for human civilization is that there will be no poor among us, that there will be no slavery. But God is not an idealist in that sense. Utopians can end up being a form of exploiting people or bearing down on people. God is always very honest about the reality of human brokenness and the pain that comes as a result. So, although God's design for human interaction is that there is no slavery, he puts in these safety nets where there is poverty. And the final of those different safety nets is this certain form of slavery. So the design of it is a safety net for the destitute. Okay, that's the motivation. Now, in terms of the means, there's a variety of things that are quite different than what we've seen slavery practiced throughout the world. I've written a couple down. One is that the slave trade is prohibited. In Exodus 21, you can see that you're not to be like buying and selling people in the way that's been practiced around the world. Exodus 21 verse 2 has slavery as temporary. This isn't something to be generational. It's not to bring in generational poverty or slavery, nor is it even for the full life of someone, but it's actually every 7 years the slaves are to be set free. The physical integrity is protected in a way that isn't as much as we would want today, but is something that was radically more than anything that was contemporary to the people of Israel. Exodus 21:20 speaks of the sacredness of the slave's life. That God will avenge the slave whose life is taken. And that's radically different. And then there's a bunch more of this type of thing, but one that really sticks out to me is that Deuteronomy 15 speaks of when people are set free, when people at the end of that, the temporary slavery, when they're released back to freedom, it is mandated by the God of the Old Testament, by God, that they're to be given so much provision, generous gifts, so that it's not just that they're left off to be on their own, but that they actually can get up on their feet and be able to get a start with their freedom. God cares about those individuals. Now, in the American South, when they saw these passages, they saw, hey, this is nothing like what we are being treated. What we see in these passages is that God sees us not as property, but as people. And they were willing to explore who that God is, explore the Bible, and by huge numbers, many became Christians. Not only did they become and entrust themselves to this God, but if you actually look at their anthems, the gospel anthems that slaves themselves even sung to help sustain them in faith and in hope for freedom, you can see that the Bible animates that the seeds of abolition of slavery from the perspective of these slaves is found in Scripture, and that's what they stood upon. And you can see, therefore, that those who've used the Bible to justify horrific chattel slavery and human rights violations are misappropriating the text. Now, another question that has come in quite a bit to whenever we do this type of talk is, why are there gross passages in the Bible? Isn't this supposed to be a sacred text? And one of the ones that is at the forefront of people's minds when they ask this is often the story from Genesis of Lot and his daughters. So here, I'll summarize briefly. Lot was a nephew of the very famous Abraham, and he lived by the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Eventually, he moved into those very vile twin cities. And one day, he gets these divine guests. They come to him, and he is generous with his hospitality. The townspeople come, and they say, we want to violate those guys. We want to sexually assault them. And Lot says, no, you don't sexually abuse my guests. They're my guests, but you can have my daughters. It's a complete betrayal of a father's responsibility to his daughters. Well, the divine guests intervene, and they remove the daughters and Lot to a place of safety while judgment comes down on Sodom and Gomorrah. Sometime later, I don't know how long, sometime later, the Lot's daughters, they're adults, and they begin to despair of finding a good match. They can't find a good man or any man. And so they get their dad drunk 2 different occasions. On each occasion, they sleep with their dad in his drunkenness against his consent, and they become pregnant. It's a story of incest and of rape. It's rape because there's no consent. They get their dad drunk to have sex with him against their will, his will, sexual abuse. And they get pregnant, and they each give birth to a son. And those sons go on to found these very problematic empires that are ripe with exploitation. It's a very sad story, a story of a betrayal of a father's responsibility to his daughters. It's a story of sexual abuse and incest. It's dark. It's dirty. Why is a story like that included in the Bible? And there's a number of stories like this. Well, my colleague Joe Vitelli helpfully said, stories like this show us that God refuses to participate in a religious cover-up. God refuses to participate in a religious cover-up. Some tuning in have probably been hurt themselves, whether it's because of sexual abuse or any manner of abuse or neglect or whatever, gaslighting from people in ministry, from pastors and speakers and stuff. And sometimes, and it's not just in the church. I worked in Parliament Hill for a long time, and people who are in leadership, people who are respected, often organizations and institutes will try so hard to cover for those who are in the greater position of leadership. But God refuses to participate in that. And so you'll see that in this passage and in passages about David or Joshua and others, where there is a betrayal of faith, a betrayal of those in their care, God in no way tidies it up. And this is interesting because you'd think that if we were, that you would think that God would have a vested interest, or at the very least, like those who've been the fathers and mothers of the faith would want to tidy up those passages, to remove the awkward parts, especially the stories where it shows someone like David who did something that was vile and violent. But God and his people have been willing throughout the centuries to say, look at the reality of human depravity. See how even some of the people who take their faith so seriously and are in leadership still do some terrible and sometimes even criminal things. And so there's such comfort, I think, for me and anyone who's been hurt to see that God does not participate in a religious cover-up. But there's more to passages like this. There's also always some rich lessons we can see in them. One for me is you can see how Lot's betrayal of his daughters messes their own relationship to others and themselves and their own sexuality. You can see how it hurts them. And I see in this a responsibility for me to take seriously about caring for those in my care. Otherwise, there's some real painful consequences. And third, my colleagues and I often are speaking to people about their intellectual doubts. But in my years serving as a pastor, and then even on this job now in apologetics, I think that I've seen more people in their 20s, later 20s, walk away from their faith in God, not because of intellectual doubts, but because over time, God doesn't come through for them in the ways they want it. And specifically for people in their late 20s, I hear a lot from people like, I can't find, like, there's no good guys at church. And eventually, like, you know what, they compromise the Bible's teaching on marriage and sexuality and kind of fade away from God. And I see that in this passage, that Lot's daughters, they don't end up doing these toxic practices, incest and abuse. They don't do this because they've necessarily begun doubting God's existence. It's because they've begun to try to take their life into their own hands in an unhelpful way. And I find this very helpful, not just for those I speak to, but for myself, that God is never in my debt, that I'm never to be entitled or bitter against God, but to be seeking to entrust even the parts of my life of my sexuality and family and these things, even when life is filled with disappointment in that regard. And so again, a passage like this can inform us on some of these very intimate things. It's not just about intellectual, though, but the matters of our heart. But finally, I see in a passage like this that darkness doesn't have the final word, or at the very least, it doesn't need to. It's a very dark passage, but that's not the end of the story of Lot and his daughters. So they have this incest and abuse, and the generations go on, and it's a very pagan culture that's birthed by this situation. And along the way comes a woman named Ruth, and she's one of the great grandchildren, a result of that story of Lot and his daughters. It's their descendant. And Ruth is in this pagan culture. She's a Moabite, and yet she actually entrusts her heart and her life and even her marriage prospects and all of that. She entrusts that to God, and she sees him as gracious and worth her trust. And she makes like, the faith of the Bible her own. And when she does that, it's a huge turning point in her life. And she goes on to become I think it's the great-grandmother of King David, one of the great redemptive figures of the Bible. And then she goes on to be the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus, which not only means that Ruth is a great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus, but so is Lot's daughters. And there's a lot of honor in that. And what that shows me is even in these moments that can seem gross in our own life or messy in our own life, where maybe we've done something, a betrayal of all that we believe in, or others have done a betrayal of us, it doesn't have to have the final word. But that if we can be like Ruth and let God into our lives, let him into the darkest, messiest parts, we will encounter the graciousness of God, that he can redeem the things that are broken. And so maybe some who are tuned in today, maybe it's not your whole life, but there's a piece of your life that just feels dark and gross because of some way others have hurt you or you've hurt others. And I want to encourage you to see in a story like in Lot and his daughters, and the following story, Ruth, David, Jesus, that we're able to let God into the most painful parts of our life. I find that when we look with seriousness at these passages and are willing to wrestle with the tough stuff of the Bible, we'll see that God is not a moral monster, but that he is a gracious God. So thank you so much for giving me a hearing. And now I think we're going to have a time to chat together.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. You've really flipped a lot of these on their head and really given us something completely different to consider in these passages. It's hard for us sitting here in North America in the 21st century to really get a sense of the ancient Near East. I mean, it was a very different time. You characterized it well. It was brutal. It was nasty. It was, life was cheap. Warfare was everywhere. That's got to
Absolutely.
change a person, right? That's got to change who you are. And it really struck me to remember, I guess, and I don't think I've ever really thought about this, but the ancient nation of Israel wasn't just this nation that was kind of plopped down in the middle of these brutal people, but it came from this, and so they came from this kind of a mindset. So, we might look at Leviticus or some of the older books and see a whole bunch of rules, a whole bunch of like, what is this about food and clothing and all this practices and stuff, and we kind of don't get it, and we kind of think, well, this is actually a bit morally inferior as well. What is God trying to do behind all of these? Would you say, is there a bigger purpose to what God's doing?
Yeah, if you've ever yourself tried to change a behavior or a thought pattern that's toxic, you'll find that it's really hard, that you go through a season of trying to, of seeing that you need to change, trying to change, and it's frustrating, and it takes a long time. If that's true for yourself or me, individuals, how much more when these thought patterns or behaviors are part of the fabric of a culture. And Jen, like you said, the people of Israel, the ones that God had kind of selected to reveal to them and then through them to us, the heartbeat of God, they were of these cultures where there's so much vile, toxic practices, practices that often reflect the recesses of our own selves. And I think that just as I would want someone to be patient with me as I try to change, I think you see that God is very patient. And so there are provisions in the law of Moses that are sometimes disappointing to us because we wish that God was a little tighter on some of these laws, requiring them to maybe have no slaves instead of making a safety net that allowed for this form of slavery. But God is often like he is. You see through the law of Moses and throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament that God is sometimes using the law of Moses as the beginning step of bringing these people to change. And so there's certain things where God is kind of generous to allowing some of the behaviors that they were engaging in, but in a like more kind of a more holy, like a first step. And then as the Bible continues, you'll see that God actually reveals more of his design for that. And so slavery is an example where what you see, I think, of slavery is radically better than what was being practiced all around them and even from among them. And then as you get into the New Testament, you see Paul writing to Philemon and saying, or writing on behalf of Philemon, I believe, and he's calling on him to treat the slave differently than you might even find in the Old Testament in a way that's even better. And you can see that God is like slowly being patient and letting people see that some of the laws of Moses is God's generous, kind of slow teaching tool to give time for improvement.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So these weren't the end goal.
No.
The end goal was like Genesis 1, right?
Exactly.
And so I think sometimes we don't really have that perspective, and we also don't have the perspective, I think, of the surrounding nations and just how different things were. And we were talking earlier, and you were talking about the woman who was suspected of adultery, and you really didn't like the story in the Bible of she had to drink a bitter water, and if her stomach, and you thought this is just wrong, and yet when you looked into it deeper and you learned what the practices of the other surrounding nations were, you said, oh, actually, this is actually quite good. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. It's just something, again, reading the Bible growing up, I'd come across this passage. I think it's in Numbers. And it's if a husband suspects their wife of committing adultery, they go to the priest, and the priest will give the woman some water that they pray over, and then she drinks it. And if the water becomes kind of bitter for her and is painful, then it shows that she committed adultery. And if the water, it just acts like water, then she did not commit adultery. And I just thought this is both a little kooky and I think maybe misogynistic or something. That's how I felt. I should say right here that what helped me understand that passage, and I'll share that in a minute, comes from this book right here, Is God a Moral Monster? We make no money off sales of this book because this is not a colleague or anything, but it's by Paul Copan, and it's been hugely helpful for wrestling through all these different questions, and it is the inspiration for today's talk, which is Gracious God or Moral Monster. This book is called Is God a Moral Monster? And Paul Copan helpfully points out that you'll see something special about that passage and that way of the adultery test if you look at the types of guilty tests, which would include adultery, of the Hittites and Canaanites and the people around them. The practice that they did not involve water, it involved tar. And what they would do is that if someone was suspected of something but they didn't know for sure, they would take someone, say a prayer to their gods, and throw them in like a tar pool, which they had around in ancient Near East naturally. And if the person could swim, climb out of the tar, they were innocent. But if the tar kind of sucked them down and they couldn't get out, they were guilty. Well, think about a couple things there. When you just drink water, if there's no like divine act, water is just going to be water. And for those who might not even believe in God, like what's wrong? Like the water is just going to be water, they'd think. Like it's not so controversial. But the tar is going to mess you up, especially if you're someone who is sickly, weak. And so say regarding the adultery accusation, say you have a husband and his wife is sick and he's sick of her, throw her in the tar pond after saying some prayer to the pagans gods, and she's not climbing out. She's really sickly. So it really it biases the test against the sickly and the weak, and it assumes you're guilty unless if there's kind of like a divine intervention that the person somehow has the strength to climb out. So it's guilty until proven innocent by your strength getting out of the tar pond. That's the context the people of Israel would have known for suspecting someone of guilt. And then God in saying water is saying not tar, water, and it's innocent. It's just water, but it will take an act of God to reveal that there's some guilt. And then finally, why even have a test for adultery? Well, you can have a couple, even a healthy couple, and for some reason, maybe they give birth to a kid and the kid just doesn't look that much like the dad. And sometimes it's just genetics, but the dad might be starting to break trust. And if you don't have a test for trying to find an answer, then it leaves the woman, especially in this ancient context, very vulnerable to her husband's ongoing suspicion. And that's something that the husband may have trouble shaking. By God providing this test of the water, it's both safe for those who are weak and sickly, and it's able to remove any question of guilt when the water shows that it doesn't become bitter. And so I hope that makes sense. If I'm losing you on this, pick up the book. You're not going to regret it. It's he speaks to this with such clarity.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, some of the examples that he provides that really give you a context for what we're talking about with vis-a-vis God's regulations. You were talking in your presentation about God calling for violence, or I guess more in the context of judging evil. And I thought that was really important point to make. And in this book here, there's a man who grew up in the former country of Yugoslavia, and he really struggled with the Joshua judgments on Canaan. And he said, I just don't think wrath suits God. It's really not becoming of God. He had the unfortunate opportunity to live through some very difficult ethnic conflict in Yugoslavia. And he came out of that, probably in the midst of it, and realized, I would rebel against a God who did not look with wrath in the face of evil. How would it have been different? Would it have been better if God had not judged Canaan through these, through Joshua and those things?
Yeah.
Like, what would have happened, I guess, if that had not happened?
Fair. I was with, I got to speak to a bunch of human rights activists last week. And one of the things, I was there to speak to them, but one of the things I learned from them was the saying that hate isn't the direct opposite of love, indifference is. Hate isn't the opposite of love, like indifference is. And a God who doesn't bring judgment where there is gross human rights violations, like what's happening in Canaan, is a God who's indifferent. And remember Ezekiel 16, this is the sin of Sodom, pride, excess, but they did not aid the poor and the needy. God is not indifferent. And by bringing judgment where people have done these horrific human rights violations, God is also showing us, teaching us that we can't be indifferent either, that we have an obligation to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. That's a direct quote from Proverbs 31, also from the Bible, that God is anything but indifferent to the suffering of human beings. Yeah. And it's sometimes painful to consider that there's consequences for crimes and for exploitation of the vulnerable. But a judge, like a judge who just let a criminal go free who's done horrible things because the judge is like, I'm so nice. That's not a nice judge. That's a corrupt judge. And God is not corrupt, as we see from these passages.
Yeah. And I think that the Israelites lived in this context where they would understand that, but we don't read it in the Bible. It's not in chronological order. We don't have, God's thoughts behind the actions of Joshua. It's all separated out. So if you don't really dig into the context, you're going to get a very superficial view of it, and you might come to conclusions that are wrong about these passages.
One tip that I think might help in reading the Bible is that, like you said, about the chronology not always being there. So you'll have a bunch of historical books that are after each other, like Joshua, Judges, Ruth. You have First and Second Kings before that, First, Second Samuel, Chronicles later. So you have all these like historical books, and then later in the anthology that is the Bible, we have all these books of prophecy. And so sometimes you have like Zechariah, which is included later in the anthology that is the Bible, takes place at the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah, which is with the like more historical books. So if you take a very light reading of the Bible and don't take it that seriously, you may miss some of the depth and the richness and the beautiful context if you're willing to look at Ezra and Nehemiah and then look at Zechariah, and you kind of sometimes get behind the scenes, or the book of the end of Second Chronicles with the exile, and you can go read Jeremiah and Ezekiel, these prophets, and the prophets are revealing God's heart to us. And so again, some of making sense of the historical passages that can be troubling, like Sodom and Gomorrah, you find the heartbeat of God behind the judgment in Ezekiel 16, which is later in the Bible. So if you get to know your Bible, if you're going to criticize, especially if you're going to criticize the God of the Bible, take time to actually understand the book, and that you might find that the criticism is unwarranted.
Yeah. Right. No, and I think that's an important point. And there certainly are guides to helping you to read it in chronological order that would help, because you're not going to remember what you just said, I don't think.
Fair. I'm a forgettable guy. Yeah.
Okay, so talking about the Bible then, and you kind of alluded to this already, but I know that there's going to be people out there who, these gross passages you're talking about, these people who do things that are just sinful, horrible, and some people are going to look at that and think, well, it's in the Bible. The Bible is considered a moral and ethical guidebook, and it is, but is that all that the Bible is?
Yeah, by no means. The Bible is so much more. If we treat the Bible like it's all just a moral ethical guide for us, we're gonna be misapplying and misappropriating the Bible. And so one distinction people make is that there are some passages of the Bible that are prescriptive, where it's clearly telling us how to live. There's a lot of that. Jesus says that we should be loving our enemies, or we should be forgiving those who hurt us. That's prescriptive, telling us what to do, how to behave. But there's also lots of parts of the Bible that are descriptive, and those can be very rich passages. But the descriptive passages, they're not proscriptive, not telling us how to live, but they're telling us what happened. They're describing to us. And again, in that, like you can find, like I mentioned, Lot and the daughters. There's a lot of lessons you can learn from it, but by the Bible including a historical story for us, that's not in any way condoning that story, saying that that's a good thing. And so just the opposite. In these stories, you'll see gross perversion behaviors, and then you see like the consequences of that kind of behaviors and how it's so messed up. And so often people who take passages out of context will act as if they're prescriptive and a justification for violence, when really it's God showing violence for what it is. So much more than the Bible being just an ethical whatever. The Bible can be read as a grand story of God's rescue mission for the brokenness of this earth, and for all those all who've been hurt by that, which is all of us. The Bible is not just a bunch of random stories or ethical rules, but it is building up to the moment of the death of God, of the death of Jesus and the resurrection, and seeing what unfolds from there. And so we need to be intentional about reading the Bible the way it was written to be read.
Well, okay, so you're talking about the Bible now as a grand story, and yet a lot of people would approach the Old and New Testament and see an angry, wrathful God bent on violence, bent on judgment in the Old Testament, and then this loving, kind, gracious God in the New Testament. And they would say, either this is a different God or this doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So
If you feel that way, you're not alone. A lot of people feel that way. But I will submit to you that when we feel this way, it's often because we haven't taken the time to seriously look at those passages of wrath in the Old Testament or kindness and love in the New, but that we're just kind of cherry picking the maybe most famous moments from either part of the Bible. If you actually take a serious read, if you're going to criticize God, criticize the Bible, take a serious read to know what you're actually criticizing. Don't be that guy that just criticizes things they don't know. If you seriously read these passages, you'll see that these passages of wrath and judgment, like we've been hammering home this evening, are that the heartbeat behind it is justice and rescue and compassion, often, especially for the poor and the needy. So you can see the kindness of God, God's heart for rescue and for redemption throughout the very passages that have stuff of judgment and justice. Similarly, in the New Testament, if you look at the moments where you see such kindness, you can also see judgment. And the best example anywhere in the Bible of judgment is actually the same moment where you see the best example of love and compassion, and that's the cross, the death of Jesus. And there you see the fullness of all human depravity and negligence and bullying and exploitation, that the right judgment that all of that incurs poured out on God, the Son of God, Jesus. It's the most brutal judgment you see in the whole Bible. And that's also the greatest act of love of God, as Jesus, who says that no one takes his life, but he willingly lays down his life. That this isn't that Jesus was just the wrong place, wrong time. That Jesus willingly, intentionally, that's the purpose, that he broke into our brokenness through the Christmas story, and then at the Easter story, where Jesus actually verified by eyewitnesses, with good historical evidence, that Jesus died on a cross. That is this moment of judgment and love. And so I will submit to you that you'll actually see the love and wrath of God in the Old Testament, and you'll see the love and wrath of God in the New Testament. If you actually read the Bible seriously, you'll see that it's one consistent heartbeat of God, God giving himself in the death on the cross, triumphing over that death, also verified by historical evidence. Jesus climbed out of the grave, and he is alive today, and invites all of us to be rescued from the judgment that any of us deserve, and instead be able to be recipients of God's love and kindness. So I think you see a consistent God, not two different gods.
And a lot of people would point to that, what you're just talking about with God allowing Jesus or having Jesus die on the cross as divine child abuse. And yet you said, well, that's not the case at all. This is not God ordering Jesus and Jesus having no say in it. This is Jesus willingly going. And this is God in the form of Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. This is part of the Trinity dying on our behalf. And that is really radical. And we can completely lose sight of that if we're not very aware of other faith systems, that God himself has not demanded we do certain things, because we already proved that we can't do that. He has come and paid the penalty for us. That Absolutely. Is radically different. When people say all religions are the same, no.
On the child sacrifice thing, I just recently this summer read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they tell the story of King Agamemnon, who the Greek pagan gods call on him to sacrifice his daughter, and it's just brutal and gory. And you see him, the pagan gods demand that which is most precious to us. And as I read that, I couldn't help but think of the God of the Bible, who you see giving that which is most precious to him for us. It's the opposite. And Jesus laying down his life for us isn't child sacrifice by any means, but is God himself emptying himself of all that is comfortable and powerful, and in a sense that the glory of divinity, and himself taking the fullness of shame and brokenness that you and I know so intimately well, in order to give us healing and life.
All right. I think we're going to start to transition to questions from the floor, because we've been chatting for a while and we want to give our audience the floor now. I would like to start off with some questions, maybe the first one. It looks like the Lord permits revenge on Israel's enemies throughout the Old Testament. However, Jesus, and we're given a Bible verse here, Matthew 5:39, he stated that we shouldn't seek revenge. Is this inconsistent?
Mm-hmm. Fair. Thank you for the question. I love that you're calling for consistency, and I think that it's right and fair to be asking those questions of God. Like, God, if you are just, God, if you are good, then surely you must also be consistent. An inconsistent judge who applies what is right and good in different contexts, it would be a corrupt judge, and God is the judge of all the universe. So are you being consistent? I think that we've already tried to elaborate that where you see Israel engaging in warfare that's mandated by God, it is for it's not for their revenge. Often it's not because the people they're bringing warfare to have done anything against Israel. It's often because of the cases I can think of. It's because they have done abusive things to their own people, and God is using the people of Israel to bring an end to that. And so and by no means is it like revenge. It's not that the people of Israel were slighted and now they have a divine mandate to stand up for them, to fight for their own well-being. But it's actually about care for the oppressed, and that isn't revenge. The other thing that you'll see is that we need to make a distinction between the way we handle wrongs done to us, and then the way that we handle the way that the justice system should handle a wrong. And so we're not to go all Batman-like when something is done to us or to someone we love. We're not to go and seek revenge. The new Batman trailer has that line like, "I'm revenge." But that's not the mandate we're called. As an individual, we forgive someone who's harmed us, but then we're able to still go to law enforcement, go to the state, and seek justice. And so when Jesus talks about not seeking revenge, sometimes Christians, and this perpetuates abuse, will act as if we kind of just always, like we just let people off the hook all the time. But in Jesus' words about not seeking revenge, about forgiving people, in no way does that let off the hook human rights violations, abuse, and negligence. And there is a role for the state to engage in seeking justice, and therefore a role, I think, for all of us to do our part to contribute to that. And so, yeah, I think that it's helpful to see the distinction between the individual and the state in justice and revenge.
Okay. What's up with Exodus 21, 20 to 21? I don't know if that passage rings a bell right now to you or not.
Go there.
But here's a summary. It's fine to own slaves and beat them as long as they don't die. That's a question.
Yeah,
is it fine? So what is up with that?
Yeah, so in Exodus, Exodus 21 is a question. So in Exodus 21, we can go there right now. What you'll see is that it says if someone hits their slave with a rod and the person dies, that is hugely forbidden. But if the person is hit with a rod and recovers, by no means is there the same consequence. Let's see. It's Exodus 21. Oh, there's a question gone now. Okay, I found it. Exodus 21, verse 20. When a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. So the slave will be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he's not avenged. So what you see in this, again, I think to us who have sought to abolish slavery and this type of stuff, this just seems so backward. But if you look into the context, what the people of Israel would have been used to regarding slavery is that a slave master can beat their slave dies, and that's fine, it's their slave. And so the line here where if the slave dies, that the slave will be avenged. That is meaning that in the context of Israel, in the Mosaic law, that a slave's life, that there's a sacredness there. And that even though their fellow slaves aren't going to be able to be in a position maybe to, in other cultures, to be able to stand up for that slave, in God's law, in the Mosaic law, that slave will be avenged. That slave won't be forgotten. They're not just property. They actually have some dignity. And at the same time, you can see that it's saying, but if the person isn't horribly harmed like that, the law won't come down on them like that. Now, you need to read this again in the context of the whole chapter. You'll see that if a slave is injured, so it talks about a tooth, knocks out a tooth or an eye, there are consequences for that. It says, so when a man this is the same chapter, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go because of his tooth. So even a tooth, the guy beats him and there's an injury, that he now has to set them free. Well, that's a huge disincentive to ever beat your slave. And that's an even bigger, just a radical departure from how slavery was practiced. And so, on the one hand, what we see is that God is improving the plight of slaves. But on the other hand, we don't see the complete abolition of slavery, which is what we would want. But again, I think that comes from, and he does a way more in-depth job in this book as God a Moral Monster, handling the various practices of slavery in the Old Testament. But we see that God is stepping into a culture that has a horrific form of slavery, making it a lot more humane. But that is by no means God's final design for our freedom and slavery. I believe that if you take a serious reading of the Bible, you will see, as William Wilberforce and other abolitionists throughout history have seen, that we as human beings should be fighting for the full abolition of slavery. And it's something that I continue to be involved with today in fighting against human trafficking. I think that's a biblical mandate, even if God didn't compel the people of Israel a couple thousand years ago to make that decision then. I hope that helps.
And I think the word to slavery, he spent some time looking at that, the actual word that is used.
Yeah.
And it's actually not the slavery, like the chattel slavery that we think about when we think about, say, the American South, where it was a property, an ownership of this life. It was actually a debt, servant. You're paying off a debt by going to, either you're paying off a debt or you have no other place to turn and you're being given a job, right? So it's more of a servanthood than a slavery. So I think that word comes across very harshly. There's actually a bit more to it that doesn't come out when we just use the one word and we jump to a conclusion on what exactly that's
But yeah,
about.
so it says the questions from Julia, and anyone else who still is like unsatisfied with our handling of it. I would encourage you, if you're watching this, I know you know how to use the internet. So YouTube, Brandon Cleaver. YouTube's so good, you can probably misspell it and you'll still find him. Brandon Cleaver, Slavery. YouTube it. It's my colleague. He has some very helpful, succinct videos on the subject. Or, read the book. You will be grateful you did. Let's go to the next question.
Yes. So we're going to go to Judges 11 now, and this is a story about Jephthah. I don't know how to say his name. Anyway, he comes back from a battle, and before he gets home, he says, the first thing that I see, I'm going to sacrifice to God, and out comes his daughter. Why didn't God intervene like he did with Abraham and Isaac and prevent him from sacrificing his daughter? Because he actually went ahead and did that.
Yeah. So first, Matt, that's a great question. Thank you for it. That's something I've struggled with myself. Something helpful. Again, I'm going to keep referring to him, but Paul Copan talks about he's not the first. There's a lot of serious Bible theologians, scholars who their full-time focus is to know this stuff, and they make a compelling case that the word that is used in that passage about to devote his daughter to destruction, that is not by any means necessarily meaning that he sacrificed her, the way that we would picture, but rather that he dedicated her to the service of the Lord. And that's similar to Samuel, who's dedicated to the service of the Lord. And it's a beautiful story that we know where Hannah, his mother, dedicated him to the service of the Lord. It probably included, in Jephthah's case with his daughter, a commitment to singleness. And you can see in that passage as she goes and mourns with the other virgins, that this is, in many ways, does include a huge loss for her. So I think that first, the passage might not be as dark as we see on first reading. And it's fair. We're dealing with a translation, all of us who read the Bible in English. It was written in Hebrew a long time ago, and so it does take work to wrestle with, what is the best word to translate that as? The other thing that this passage shows us is that we need to be very serious about the commitments we make. And I think that all of our lives would be a lot more whole and healthy if we took from Jephthah the rashness of his words and his commitment, and saw that we too should be very careful in the kind of commitments that we make. I think that's really helpful. Again, I'm just going to keep saying this. I sound like an infomercial, but he deals with it with more time than we have now.
Yeah. Okay. Apparently someone's won a prize. That's awesome. It seems that the Old Testament allows for colonization. But the person submitting this question, who's anonymous, says they're uncomfortable with this. Does God promote colonization? And they include this involving Christians evangelizing.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. Does the Bible allow for colonization? I think that's a really fair question, especially in light of the fact Many of the West's like big empires and colonizers, which includes the United Kingdom, Spain, some would argue the States, but I'm not getting into that right now. McDonald's, Nike. That some of these empires have been like identified as very like Christian empires and have used language that may apply to Israel coming into the land of Israel that God promised them in the Old Testament as a justification for their kind of global expansion or something. We need to not just take their word for it, but actually look at the Bible. And one of the passages that's helpful for me on the topic of colonization is the final book of the Bible, which is Revelation. And at the Revelation speaks of kind of the end of this world as we know it. And you see all these different peoples of the world, every tribe, language, and nation. Since you have all the flavors of the earth, all these flags, people coming to worship the one true God. Notice there that if the Bible was calling for colonization, and you have a lot about the people of Israel, you'd expect the peoples of the earth to come as one language, the peoples of the earth to come under one flag, and to worshiping God in Hebrew. But that's not the case. And it's something that's very fascinating and I think subversive and different about Christianity versus some of the other major religions. That they often will carry, like Islam, for example, like it carries with it Arabic, and Arabic is a beautiful language. But like when people when they become a Muslim, they have to pray to God in Arabic. They have to read the Quran in Arabic, and so there's a certain type of like cultural colonization that comes with the moving forward of a language that you have to all submit to, but not so with the Bible. That God actually that the Bible uses the language of salt. Redeeming, like that we're to be, as we go into all the world, we're to be like salt. And what does salt do when you apply it to meat, especially in the ancient context? It's used to preserve the meat, and it's one of the spices that they had access to. It draws out the flavor. And in many ways, as Christianity has permeated the world, it actually is able to kind of be a redemptive, healing, and even like salty, like bring out the full flavor of the various cultures around the world. It doesn't try to supplant the people or the culture, but it brings out the best of them and calls all peoples to forsake the toxic, kind of unhealthy parts of that culture. And so you see that in the book of Revelation. I think that there has not been a colonization of the world in the name of God. That's not what God wants. Another helpful thing, if you go back to the Old Testament to see how God handles the various nations, is that those who are really going to the Midianites, the Moabites, the Canaanites, Babylon, Nineveh, all these different places are often these prophets. And God sends those prophets, and God does in no way sends those prophets to say, submit to Israel. Jonah is a great famous example. A lot of you have heard of Jonah. So Jonah goes to Nineveh, and he calls on Nineveh. Well, he warns them of judgment. And the result is that the people of Nineveh turn away from toxic practices and turn to God. But in no way do they then submit to Israel. There's no like colonization going on here, but that you see this like redeeming and safety and well-being for the people of Nineveh, for Babylon, which is actually an enemy of Israel. You'd expect Jonah to come and try to like make them servants of Israel. So this is the opposite of colonization, I think. There's no that's not the case. And so I think that if you take a careful reading of the prophets and of the story of the Bible, you see that there is no mandate for colonization, but a celebration of the peoples, and especially of those who are oppressed.
All right. This is our next question here. Why did you think God smote Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5? Does he still do that nowadays? If not, why not?
Great question. So I know there's people tuning in who are not familiar with the Bible, so I know I'm a little long-winded sometimes. I'll just have to give context. So in this text, this is a New Testament passage. So again, those who think the New Testament just has nice, like pleasant things, no, there's some pretty tough stuff there too. And in this situation, this is the early history of the church. This is just the time quite recent after the resurrection of Jesus. And a lot of people are selling their property and giving it to the church and for the Christian community. Some of that is being classic Bible stuff being used for the well-being of the poor, and also just like the well-being of the community. And so it's a really exciting time. And if you read the passage in Acts 5, and just before, I think you see also in Acts 2, you see a lot of just this like very happy thing going on with like so much generosity. And in the midst of all that generosity, there's a couple, Ananias and Sapphira, and they sell their property, and they take a bunch of their property, and they give it to the church, which is fine, and they say we gave all of it. And they're lying to God and to the church, and they get struck down. And one of the things that you see in that is that they're like, hey, you didn't have to tell us you gave everything. You didn't even have to give everything. Like by only giving part of your income that you got from the sale of the property, you weren't doing anything bad. You could have just given part of it and kept some for yourself. That's okay. You have every right to do that. But you lied, and they're held accountable for that. I know like often we want we often can not just lie to others, but even lie to ourselves about our motivations for stuff. But it shows that in their like generosity, that it was more about their own name and reputation than it really was about the well-being of others. I see from a passage like this that one, God doesn't just want our money, he doesn't just want our tithes, but he really wants our hearts. And I think as human beings, we can often approach religious stuff, spiritual things, as if it's just about our behavior, and we try to be like holy in our behavior. And so Ananias and Sapphira are like, oh, we have money, but God cares about their honest heart. Second, God doesn't really tolerate with people playing with him and saying to God, like, hey, we're giving you everything, but actually not, like you're playing with God. And there's a whole variety of ways that we can find ourselves kind of doing that with God and not being honest with our friends and community and kind of lying about who we are. And that's a very dangerous, toxic place. And whether you end up like Ananias and Sapphira, it's like right there, you're struck down, or it's or you get to just seem to continue on in your lies. Like you are actually eroding your own integrity and well-being. And so I think that whether or not, when we start doing this, we go down a toxic path. I think I see that very clearly from a passage like that. I tend to want God to not bring judgment on anybody. I just want God to let people off the hook when they do bad stuff. I'll say that even though I think a lot of the time people don't receive judgment right away like Ananias and Sapphira did, before moving on to the next question, we should stop and say, you know what? The Bible actually does promise that we're all going to receive judgment for the various toxic, selfish, lying things that we do, unless we're willing to look to God for forgiveness. And so we should treasure the forgiveness of God and that he washes away our guilt, but never just presume upon it. So we should take a passage like this as a warning that we'll suffer the same kind of fate they did unless we actually receive God's grace.
Yeah, I think we do take grace for granted a
Yeah.
lot in
Today's
our
topic,
culture.
gracious God, a moral monster. I think in many ways, you want us to like moral monster or like just a nice softy.
Yeah.
God isn't a softy, but he's good and he's gracious, but we shouldn't just take that for granted. But I'm long-winded. Let's go to the next question.
All right. We probably just have time for two more.
Okay.
So why did God reject Cain's offering of the produce of the land?
Mm-hmm. Hey,
He gave it to him.
fair.
What's the big deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just real brief. I don't think I can give a long, but it seems that his brother Abel, who's offering God really treasured, that it was given from like it was truly a sacrifice from his heart. That he was really giving God the sacrifice. I think it was of sheep, which is an ancient way of worshiping God by sacrificing your thing, and that it really was like a sincere sacrifice. And there seems to be something about Cain's sacrificing of his like fruits and vegetables or something, that it was kind of begrudging and just going through the motions, but not really done for God. And I just know in my own life, even whether it's whatever the sacrifice of my life can be, even if it's volunteering, caring for the poor, whatever it might be, just being kind to my wife and obedient to God and honoring her. That if I can go through the motions, but my heart isn't really doing it with sincerity, that I am just flattering myself, and there's nothing really beautiful about that. God is not just interested in our moral behavior. He loves us and invites us to relationship with him. And that's what Abel was demonstrating through his sacrifice. And it seems that Cain wasn't really interested in a personal relationship with God.
Right.
Thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's great. Actually, I'm looking at this next question, and this one I think is a hard question.
Okay.
We're going to end with it. Why would God say, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated? Doesn't he also claim to be the God of love? How can he be loving and love if he hates?
That's a
That's
great
a
question.
hard question.
That is a hard one. It's come up a couple
That's
times
tough.
with these Q&As like this. What the person is referring to is that in Malachi 1 and in Romans 9, so Old Testament and New Testament, we have this line, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. In the context of the Bible, Jacob and Esau were twin brothers, but they often are used, those names referred to their descendants. So Jacob represents like those who are God's children, those who are believers in him, and then Esau refers to those who are not, have not received God's invitation to be his children. But so Esau, Jacob, two different approaches to God. One rejects him, one accepts him. But God says in John 3:16, Jesus says, "For God so loved the world." Doesn't the world include Esau? I think that the language of hate is being used only by a comparison of loves. What I mean by that would be, I love my job. And if any colleagues are watching this, I love you. I love working with you. But when there is a contest between my job and my wife, I will always choose my wife. There's no contest.
Good thing.
It's the way it needs to be. So in comparison to my love for my wife, it's as if I hate my job because there's no contest between those commitments. And God uses the language, precisely the example I'm giving of a husband and a wife. He uses that to show his love for his children, for Jacob. An example is Hosea. In the book of Hosea, God in the Old Testament calls this man Hosea to marry a woman who seems in that context to be damaged goods. She's a prostitute. He is to love her and to treasure her. And his wife ends up cheating on him. She ends up selling herself back into prostitution. Like, it's really dark and kind of messed up. She betrays him. But Hosea loves her and he treasures her and he never gives up on her, but continues to seek to woo her, invite her, and redeem her back to himself. And God says, "This is my love for Jacob." And so does God love all the world? He does. Does God give us an invitation to become part of Jacob, to become part of God's children, his family, to be like a bride to Jesus? Absolutely. But again, we can't just take that for granted, that if we reject God's invitation, then we are like Esau. And does God provide so much gift and care for us in so many ways? Absolutely, he does. He loves us, but we don't have that covenantal relationship, that steadfast, like that type of love that God gives Jacob. And so it's hate only by comparison. If we can just wrap up with this, just give me another minute, there's something so insightful of the original Jacob and Esau, not just the peoples, but the brothers. Jacob, he refers to God only ever as the God of his father, of Abraham, of Isaac, his grandfather and his father. He doesn't have like a personal relationship with God until there's one night where God comes to him in the form of a man. The angel of God comes to him, and Jacob wants a blessing from God. And they wrestle, and the man goes to leave, but Jacob wrestles with him, won't let him go, and he won't let him go. They wrestle all night, and finally God blesses Jacob, and as he does so, he gives him a limp. From that point on, Jacob refers to God as his God. You can see that the blessing Jacob gets isn't just material stuff, but God becomes his God. And yet there's also a limp that he carries for the rest of his life. For me, as I wrestle with tough stuff of the Bible, sometimes I think it'd be easier to just not worry about it. But when we wrestle with the tough questions, when we have intellectual doubts and we actually are willing to look and find if there's anything to them or if there's a concrete answer. When we do the hard work, it's like we're wrestling with God. And there's great blessing there. I think you'll find that like the only way to have a real relationship with God is to bring the gross and painful and confusing parts of our hearts that even doubt and can be sometimes upset with them, and bring them to God and lament, and to let God into those parts. And in doing so, sometimes more questions will arise, and it's more uncomfortable. In that case, is sometimes a limp. Things aren't as black and white if you wrestle with it. And yet, it's not just not black and white gray. It's like not black and white, the myriad of vibrancy of colors that as we let God into our lives. So if you're someone who's exploring Christianity, or even if you're not, maybe you're watching because you just love all the gory stuff and dark, and you're just like want to ask your toughest questions, I want to challenge you that if you wrestle with the evidence for is the Bible actually a divine book? And if you, more than anything, wrestle with the evidence about Jesus' death and resurrection, the eyewitness, hostile, unlikely sources, you'll see that the God of the Bible is not only real, but he's really good, and he's really worth all of ourselves, that he is a gracious God. Thank you so much for joining us. I think there's still a few more components tonight, but I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Daniel. I think you've really turned things upside down from what people might be normally reading these passages of, brought a lot more context to it, a lot more of, I think, God's person to it. Person's not the right word for God, but you know what I mean? Like we see his character, we see his heartbeat, we see what is behind these things, and you don't see that on a simple reading of the passage. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate your thoughts at the end too, that doubt is normal. People have doubts, and it's not the opposite of faith. And to wrestle with those doubts is fine, and it's part of growing in your relationship with God. So I'm sorry if you asked a question and we didn't get to it. There's probably a ton of great questions still in that queue. But I thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Can I just say, if your question wasn't answered, our goal tonight wasn't, I didn't want to be the guy to just be able to have all the answers for you. But we hope somehow, as you see us kind of wrestle through this stuff, that you're learning some ways that you can find the answers yourselves. You don't need a pope, and you don't need a pastor or me to be like giving all the answers. You can actually wrestle with the scripture yourself, to get to know the Bible, to really be a student of it and find the life in it yourself. I've mentioned this book by Paul Copan. Another amazing one that will help you with this is The God I Don't Understand by Christopher Wright. Deals with a lot more of these questions some of you are asking. Another one that deals with the pastoral pain, and not just in the Bible but our own life, is by my friend Amy Orr Ewing, Where is God in All the Suffering? These books will give you a grid that will help you wrestle through stuff. Yeah, so good. One more, and this is one more book. They're pointing to look this way. One more book that is so helpful is by Jen Wilkin. I read it this past week, just randomly. It's called The Woman of the Word. And this book, these ones deal with these tough passages. This book will help you, whether you're a woman or a man, I'm a man, will help you know how to study the Bible for all it's worth. And I think this, even more than those maybe, will help you know how you yourself can actually find answers to your tough questions in the Bible. It's such a quick read. I promise this is not an infomercial. I just want you to have the tools to do this. I know we're over time. It's by Jen Wilkin, Woman of the Word. Love this book.
Nothing else we could. Okay.
That's enough. There's more. Let's just leave it there.
Thank you. I think you've got great resources now at your disposal. Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you, everyone, for participating. I want to remind you that we're going to be doing this again in December. December 4th is our next dialogue, and it's going to be with George Sinclair and Ben Jolliffe. We're going to be jumping into Christmas at the beginning of December, and we're going to be looking at some of the classic skeptical challenges to the Christian Christmas narrative. So please join us. You can register tomorrow. Our site will be up and ready for registering for this. You do need to register, though, especially if you want to be able to submit your questions, as you sort of discovered tonight if you didn't register. So register for that, and we'll join you. We'll be here. Unfortunately, you'll be there, but we'll see you then. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.